That Christmas Eve, under the tree, the gift bearing my name was empty. My stepmother insisted I was lying, and by morning, the whispers started. She hit her with lies. Years later, caught between two weddings scheduled for the same day and a family torn apart. My father lit one candle. Its flame illuminated the one thing we all refused to see, and then everyone finally understood who had been pulling the strings all along. My name is Nora Fielding. I am 32 years old. I live in Red Haven, Colorado, where the mountains look like sharp blue cutouts against the sky, and the air is always thin and clean. I work for North Star Logistics Systems. My title is Supply Chain Analyst, which is a sterile way of saying I spend 10 hours a day making things fit. I find efficiencies. I look at a complex system: intake, processing, warehousing, distribution, and I find the friction points. I analyze the flow of goods, and I find the bottlenecks. I reroute the flow. I make sure that what is promised on one end of the country arrives intact, on time, on the other. I am paid well because I am very, very good at making things make sense. My job is about data, about measurable inputs and predictable outputs. A truck leaves at 4:05. It must arrive at 8:10. The system works because the truth of the manifest is absolute. There is no room for interpretation. There is only what is on the list and what is in the truck. I wish I had learned this at home instead of at work. My family is a blended system, but it never optimized. It just accreted, gathering mass without logic. My father, Graham Fielding, remarried when I was 9 years old. He married Marla Vance, a woman with a laugh like wind chimes and a smile that could disarm a battalion. And with Marla came her daughter, Brielle. Brielle is now 27, 5 years my junior, and she has, for her entire life, been the system's absolute center of gravity. She is the sun. The rest of us are just orbital bodies, required by unspoken rules to keep her bright and warm. In our family, logistics are not based on efficiency or fairness. They are based on Brielle's emotional temperature. She has always been the centerpiece of every holiday, every photograph, every conversation. She is bright and loud and demanding of the light, and Marla has always ensured she receives it, managing the spotlight with the precision of a theater technician. The memory that defines everything, the one that serves as the root file for all the others, clicks into place like an old slide projector. It is grainy and tinged with that specific yellow light of old film. It was Christmas, the year I turned 10. The tree was an enormous Douglas fir that scraped our vaulted ceiling, dripping with tinsel and heavy with the sharp, clean scent of pine resin that stuck to your fingers. Underneath it, the shag carpet was a sea of red and green foil paper, and there, tucked behind a larger box, was a small, perfectly wrapped silver gift with a stiff red bow. The tag, in Marla's looping cursive, read, "To Nora, from Santa." My hands were small, the ribbons stiff and cold. I remember the sound it made as I pulled the bow undone. I tore the paper carefully, the way my father had taught me, and lifted the lid of the cardboard box. I looked inside. There was nothing, just a single, folded sheet of white tissue paper lying flat at the bottom. I remember the specific silence of that tissue paper, the way it held the shape of the empty space. I looked up, confused, not hurt or angry, just confused. I was a child who believed in manifests. "It's empty," I said. My voice was quiet. "There's nothing inside." I did not say it with malice. I said it as a statement of fact, an inventory correction for Santa's workshop. Marla, halfway across the room holding a tray of mimosas for the adults, laughed. It was a bright, sharp sound, like tiny glass bells shattering. "Oh, Nora, sweetheart," she said, gliding over, her silk robe whispering. "It's a test, a little character test, to see if you're grateful for the thought, not just the gift." She smiled, that wide, cinematic smile that always charmed the relatives. She tapped my nose. "You passed." I didn't understand the test. I just knew the box was empty. But the moment passed. Brielle, who was 5, shrieked as she opened a doll that cried real tears and wet itself, and the spotlight, as it always did, moved on. Later that day, though, the narrative changed. The official record was amended. I was in the hallway, heading to the kitchen, when I overheard Marla. Her voice lowered to a conspiratorial hum, speaking to my Aunt Kate. I was just heartbroken. Kate, utterly, Marla said, and her voice actually caught. A masterpiece of subtle performance. She opened it and just invented that it was empty, fabricated it right there on the spot, to cause a scene, I suppose. For attention, it's so difficult. She can be such a difficult child. I just don't know what to do with her. By the next day, Boxing Day, the story had set. It was no longer a misunderstanding, it was an anecdote. My uncle, pouring coffee, chuckled. "Heard Nora really gave Marla a gift yesterday," he said, nudging my father. And then the phrase emerged, the one that would become the family punchline for years, the title of this grainy home movie. The kid hit her with lies. It was repeated, at Easter, when I said I didn't get any chocolate in my egg. "Careful, Marla. She might hit you with a lie." It was repeated at my 11th birthday. "Don't tell Nora the punch bowl is empty. She'll tell everyone it's a conspiracy." It was a joke, a funny story about the quiet, serious, and clearly deceptive stepdaughter. No one ever hit anyone. There was no violence in our home, not the kind people see or report. There were no bruises. There was no shouting. There was only this story, this perfect, polished narrative of my difficult nature, repeated so often by so many people that it became true. It was the most efficient system Marla ever built, and with every telling, every casual laugh, I felt myself disappearing. I was being edited out of my own life, replaced by this caricature Marla had drawn with a few brilliant strokes. I became invisible in my own home, the real me, the 10-year-old girl who saw an empty box and reported it. She was gone. In her place was this volatile, lying changeling who had to be managed. The proof is in the albums. We have volumes of them, bound in green leather, stacked by the fireplace. If you flip through them, you see the pattern. It is as clear as my logistics data. In every group photo, every Christmas morning, every Thanksgiving dinner, there is Brielle. She is dead center. She wears the yellow ribbon. She holds the prized gift. She is flanked by Marla and my father, their hands on her shoulders. And then, if you look closely, if your eyes are sharp, you see me. I am on the edge of the frame, literally. Sometimes I am half cut off by the binding, my shoulder, an ear, half a forced smile. I am the afterthought, the person they had to call. "Nora, get in the shot." Just before the flash went off, my gaze is always slightly off-center, looking not at the camera, but at the scene itself, as if I were already analyzing it, already the outsider cataloging the inventory. Brielle was the centerpiece. I was the margin. My father, Graham, is a good man. He is kind. He smells like sawdust and coffee. But he is a man who values peace above all else. He mistakes silence for harmony. He believes that if no one is yelling, everything must be fine. Conflict, to him, is the ultimate system failure. So he avoids it at all costs. He became the designated cleaner-upper. After the arguments, which were never arguments, just Marla quietly rewriting a boundary or correcting a memory, he would be the one to come in, clear the plates, and whistle a tune. He would stack the dishes, he would refill the drinks, and he would light candles. That was his signature. He hand-poured his own candles in the garage, beeswax and lavender, pine and cedar. He said they cleared the air, but they never cleared the air. They just masked the smell of unspoken resentment with something pleasant. He avoided taking sides by pretending there were no sides to take. Marla's power was never in volume. It was in language. She was a master of reasonable explanations. She curated the family's path of least resistance. Everything she did, every decision that tilted the world toward Brielle and away from me, was explained with one simple, impossible-to-argue-with phrase. "It's just easier this way." Why did Brielle get the bigger bedroom with the bay window when they moved in? Oh, Nora. She has so much more stuff. All her dolls and things. It's just easier than making her downsize. Why did we always go to Marla's parents' house for the holidays, and never my own grandmother's? They have the space, Graham. It's just easier for everyone to gather there. We don't want to make your mother host. Why was my art project, a detailed drawing of a supply chain, incidentally, moved off the fridge to make room for Brielle's second-place swim ribbon? It's just easier, honey. This magnet is stronger and holds the ribbon better. The family learned to accept this logic. Easier became code for what Marla wants, which in turn was code for what Brielle gets. It was a path cleared of all friction, and we all walked it, because fighting easier made you, by definition, difficult. I was difficult. So I learned not to be. I learned to be silent. I learned to observe. During those long Christmas evenings, surrounded by the murmur of relatives recounting the story of the empty box, I would sit on the hearth, just far enough from the fire to feel the cold draft from the window panes. I would stare at the Christmas lights, the multicolored C9 bulbs that pulsed slowly, casting thick, colored shadows on the wall. I would practice counting my own heartbeat against the rhythm of the lights. Inhale on green, exhale on red. I would count the seconds. I would analyze the structure of the tinsel. I would make a silent inventory of every ornament on the tree, sorting them by color, shape, and perceived age. I would do anything but cry. Crying was weakness. Crying proved Marla right. Crying made me the troublemaker she always said I was. I would not give her the satisfaction. I would not be a data point in her narrative. I would just sit, and I would count, and I would wait for the night to be over. That empty silver box taught me everything I needed to know. Long before I ever studied logistics, it taught me that truth is not absolute. It is not an immovable object. The truth, I learned, is fragile. It can be invisible. The truth is simply the story that is told by the person with the loudest, most confident, most charming voice. My voice was quiet. Marla's was bright and constant. Her narrative won. The box was empty. That was the data. But the story became about my lie, and the story is all anyone remembers. I sat there that night, 10 years old, watching my father light a pine-scented candle to clear the air of a conflict he wouldn't acknowledge. And I knew, right then, in the way a child knows things with absolute certainty, that I would not forget the feeling of that empty box, the seed of my own eventual audit. My own final, meticulous inventory was planted right there, in the dry needles and shadows under that fragrant, glittering tree. I just had to wait 22 years for it to grow. I became the person who fixes broken systems. At North Star, my world is binary. It is efficient. A shipment is either on time or it is late. A cost analysis is either accurate or it is flawed. I manage millions of dollars in inventory across 3 states. I optimize routes, calculate load capacities, and predict bottlenecks weeks in advance. My decisions are trusted because they are based on data, on quantifiable facts. If I tell my director that shifting our primary carrier from B-Line to Apex will save us 7% on fuel costs and 2 days on transit, he does not ask me how I feel about B-Line. He does not ask if Apex's feelings will be hurt. He signs the order. I live in a world of proof. Then, I go home. At my father and Marla's house, data does not exist. Facts are subjective. The entire household operating system is built on the emotional volatility of my stepsister, Brielle, and managed by the manipulative diplomacy of my stepmother, Marla. At home, logic is inverted. Decisions are made according to the path of least resistance, which always means maximizing Brielle's comfort and minimizing Marla's inconvenience. Trying to apply logic in that house is like trying to nail water to a wall. Nora, why do you have to analyze everything? Marla will ask, sighing, when I point out that booking 3 separate cars for a 5-mile trip is inefficient. We are a family, not one of your spreadsheets. She is right. A spreadsheet is honest. At North Star, I saw a gap. The intake program favored candidates from specific universities, overlooking the women in our own sorting and logistics departments. I proposed, designed, and funded, initially with a significant portion of my own bonus, an internal scholarship program, the North Star Ascent Grant, we call it, helping young women in entry-level positions get the certifications they need for management tracks. At the quarterly meeting, I received a standing ovation. I am respected in that building. When I mentioned it at Thanksgiving, trying to share a rare piece of good news, Marla did not look up from arranging the cranberries. "Oh, that's nice. Dear," she said. Brielle, who was complaining about the cost of her yoga instructor training, rolled her eyes. "God, Nora, is work all you do? You're always just busy." The word busy in their mouths does not mean productive. It means unavailable, cold, detached. It means I am failing at my real job, which is to be an audience for Brielle. I stopped trying to find space in their house and built my own. I bought a small condominium in a new development overlooking Lake Alder. It is a man-made lake, but the water is real. My unit is all glass and concrete, minimal and clean. I spent 2 months designing the lighting. I learned circuitry, taught myself to weld. I built the hanging pendants over my kitchen island from raw steel and Edison bulbs. The wiring is perfect. The schematics are precise. When I flip the switch, the light comes on, cause and effect. I trust it. My father, Graham, visits sometimes. He will call first, always sounding slightly apologetic, as if asking for permission to enter my airspace. "Just in the neighborhood. Thought I'd see if you needed that filter changed." He comes over and helps me with the small tasks he knows how to do, like changing the high bulbs I designed but cannot reach, or fixing a running toilet. He never stays long. He never talks about Marla or Brielle. He just works, whistles his quiet tune, and then, before he leaves, he always sets down a small brown paper bag on my counter. Inside are 2 or 3 of his hand-poured candles. "Just to freshen the place up, Nora," he says, avoiding my eyes. "Make it smell a little more like home." He means his home. He means the smell of wax and pine used to mask the silence. I accept them. I light them sometimes, not for the smell, but as a reminder of the man who chose aromatic smoke over clear air. I still go to the holidays. I go because it is easier than explaining why I am not there. Marla still organizes everything. She is a master of ceremonies, and the ceremony is always the Brielle show. Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving, Brielle's birthday, Brielle's half-birthday, Brielle's cat's birthday. Each event is a production, and Brielle is the star. She gets the toast. She gets the seat at the head of the table next to Marla. She gets the first slice of cake, and I, 32 years old, a senior analyst managing a multi-million-dollar logistics chain, am still seated at the edge. Sometimes, literally at the folding card table extension, next to a distant cousin, I am still in the margin of the photograph. The seating chart, like the narrative, is fixed. The shift happened 3 months ago. Marla had decided to finally organize the garage, which meant she hired 2 men, pointed at boxes, and directed my father and me to sort the sentimental items. I was assigned the attic crawl space, the dustiest, darkest corner. I was moving old trunks when I found it. A cracked plastic storage tub labeled Xmas Ornaments, 1999 to 2003. The air inside was stale, smelling of old plastic and decomposing tinsel. I pulled out handfuls of tangled, beaded garlands, tacky felt snowmen, and broken glass balls. And then I saw it, tucked inside a fractured porcelain angel, folded into a tight square. It was a gift tag, a small, silver rectangle with a red border. The adhesive on the back was yellowed and covered in fibers, proof it had been peeled off something. My stomach went cold. I unfolded it. The cursive was unmistakable. That same looping script from 22 years ago. To Brielle, from Santa. It was not the tag from my empty box. It was the tag from the other box. The tag that should have been on the gift I opened. Marla had not just given me an empty box as a test. She had taken a real gift, one meant for her daughter, peeled the tag off, and put my name on the empty one. It was a planned, deliberate act of sabotage. It was not a joke. It was not a test. It was an execution. I closed my hand around the small piece of cardboard. The dust from the attic felt like grit in my throat. I heard Marla downstairs, laughing about something Brielle had just said on the phone. "Oh, you are the funniest," she trilled. I slipped the tag into the pocket of my jeans. I did not say a word. I did not run downstairs and confront her. The time for that was long past. Confrontation in that house is useless. She would deny it, laugh it off, and I would once again be the difficult one, the one inventing stories. This was not a story. This was data. This was the missing piece of the manifest. I took it home, placed it in a small, acid-free envelope, and filed it in my desk drawer. It was evidence, a single, fragmented piece, and I knew, as a logistician knows, that you wait for all the pieces to arrive before you assemble the shipment. My best friend, Ray Collins, is the only person who knows the full story. Ray is a litigator. She, too, believes in data. She lives for discovery. I met her in a Krav Maga class. She's the only person I know who is more analytical about conflict than I am. I texted her a photo of the tag. Her reply came back 3 seconds later. "Nora, that is the ballgame. It is time to rewrite this story with the truth." I stood at my window, looking down at the perfect, clean lights reflecting on Lake Alder. I thought about the chaos of Christmas, the smell of pine and burnt sugar, the sound of Marla's laughter and my father's polite silence. I texted her back. The truth is the last thing anyone wants to see on a holiday. But Ray's text changed something. The discovery of the tag changed something. I stopped being a passive observer and became an active analyst. I opened a new file on my secure personal drive, the one I use for my financials. I titled it Fielding Domestic Logistics, and I started taking notes. I began to track the system's patterns. It was just like analyzing a flawed supply chain. I documented the inputs and the outputs. May 4th, dinner, I noted. Brielle announced she was quitting her third job this year. Conversation duration, 45 minutes. When I mentioned my promotion, Marla redirected the conversation back to Brielle's brave transition in under 30 seconds. Topic shift initiated by Marla. May 12th. Phone call with Graham. He asked about my car. I asked about his health. He mentioned Marla was stressed. Reason: Brielle needed money for a new apartment deposit. I noted this was the fourth such emergency in 2 years. June 1st. Family BBQ. Marla recounted the empty box story to Brielle's new boyfriend, laughed, called me her wonderfully serious girl. The anecdote was told, as always, with me in the room, as if I were a ghost. I noted the timestamps. I noted the key phrases Marla used to pivot. That reminds me, or speaking of difficult, or her favorite. Oh, Nora, let's not get into details. Details were my job. Details were the truth. My patience, the thing I had cultivated under the pulsing Christmas lights while counting my breaths, was my greatest analytical tool. I was not angry. I was not seeking revenge. I was auditing. I was building a map, a cold, hard, data-driven map of my family's emotional supply chain. And as the map grew, the bottlenecks, the diversions, and the points of friction became clearer than they had ever been. I finally saw the system, and I knew, sooner or later, a system this imbalanced was destined to break. I just had to wait for the right shipment to go missing. The first invitations I sent were objects of precision. David and I had spent a weekend on them. We chose a thick, cream-colored cardstock, uncoated, with a texture like fine linen. We had them embossed with a single, leafless branch, a nod to the winter date, December 22nd. I sealed every single envelope, 120 of them, by hand, melting a stick of dark green wax over a small flame and pressing it with my grandfather's old signet ring. The venue was Willow Court Gardens, a beautiful, restored Victorian glasshouse just outside Red Haven. The stamps were customized. The addresses were handwritten by a calligrapher. They were, in my professional opinion, logistically perfect. They were mailed in April. The phone call came in June. I was at my desk, deep in a spreadsheet detailing fourth quarter freight projections, when my office line buzzed. It was Marla. I muted my headset. "Nora, darling, you must be at your desk. You always are." Her voice was bright, a cascade of tiny tinkling bells. It was the voice she used before delivering chaos. "I have the most spectacular news. Just unbelievable." I waited. I clicked my pen. "Brielle is engaged. Her wonderful Jason. He rented a yacht in Miami. He got down on one knee. There was champagne. It was apparently just like a movie. And they are so in love. Nora. So impatient. They just do not want to wait a whole year." "Congratulations to them," I said, my voice flat. "When is the date?" "Well, that's the magical part," she trilled. "They toured the Marquis Hall. Yes, the Marquis, on the East Coast. Can you imagine? And the only day they had available for the next 18 months was December 22nd. Isn't that just destiny? Our two girls, getting married on the very same day." The line hissed. Outside my window, a truck was backing into Bay 3, the reverse alarm beeping in a steady, predictable rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. "Marla," I said, "that is my wedding day." "I know," she laughed, as if I'd pointed out a charming coincidence. "A double wedding. How fun for the family." "We are on opposite sides of the country. I sent my save the date 6 months ago. My invitations are out." The tinkling bells stopped. Her voice shifted, dropping into the smooth, reasonable, slightly wounded tone she reserved for when I was being difficult. "Nora, let's be realistic. You know how Jason's family is. They're all on the East Coast. And the Marcus Hall? Well, you don't reschedule the Marcus Hall. It's just easier this way." There it was, the family motto, the operational imperative. It's just easier. "So what does that mean, Marla?" I asked, though I already knew the manifest. "It means," she said, her voice now crisp, "that the family will obviously have to prioritize Brielle. It's her first wedding, and she needs the support. Well, you're so strong. Nora, you're so logical and independent. You always have been. You understand. We will just have to find a time to celebrate you and David properly when we get back, maybe after the new year." The line clicked. She had hung up, not a conversation, but a notification, a system update delivered. My phone rang again, almost instantly. My father, Graham. His voice was muffled, hesitant. "Nora, your stepmother she just told me the news." "And?" "Well, it's a bit of a pickle, isn't it?" he mumbled. "It's a choice, Dad," I said. I looked at the spreadsheet on my screen. The numbers were precise. They did not lie. I don't want either of you to be sad," he said, and the weakness in his voice, the desperate plea for me to solve his discomfort, made something in my chest harden. "You know how Brielle gets. She gets so worked up. Marla is just trying to keep the peace." "By erasing my wedding?" "Nora, please," he begged. Don't make this difficult." And just like that, the gears in my head shifted. The tumblers of a lock clicked into place. He was right. I would not make this difficult. I would make it clear. "It's fine, Dad," I said. The words were cool and smooth. "I understand completely. You're right. It's fine." I hung up the phone. I unmuted my headset and told my colleague I was taking my lunch break. I walked out of the building and sat in my car, the silence of the parking garage buzzing. I pulled out my phone. I texted Ray. Marla just scheduled Brielle's wedding. Same day, East Coast, priority event. Her reply was immediate, the declaration of war. "What's the counteroffensive? Do you want a war, or do you want the truth?" I stared at the steering wheel. I thought of the empty box. I thought of the whispers. She hit her with lies. I thought of 22 years of being the margin, the afterthought. The one who was strong so she could be ignored. No war. I typed back. I'm not fighting for an audience. I'm not fighting for people who have to be forced to show up. So what's the play? Fielding? I'm not fighting for the shipment. I wrote, I'm changing the destination. That evening, I did my research. I didn't cancel Willow Court. I let the deposit go. That was the decoy. Marla could track the decoy. I found a place called Lindenfall Garden. It wasn't a venue. It was a protected nature preserve on a high hill just outside Red Haven, centered around a single, massive, 300-year-old pine tree. They didn't do events. They did gatherings. They didn't have a ballroom. They had a set of long, reclaimed wooden tables that could be placed directly under the tree's canopy. It was quiet. It smelled like resin and earth and cold air. It was perfect. I booked it for 4 o'clock on December 22nd. I did not post this on social media. I did not update my wedding website. In fact, I took the website down entirely, citing a technical error. Then, the inevitable happened. My phone buzzed. A new group chat notification. Marla had created Fielding/Vance Family Hub. My stomach tightened. Her opening message, complete with a dozen sparkling festive emojis, was a corporate memo written in the language of a loving mother. Darlings, as you all know by now, we have a wonderful, crazy, spectacular conflict. 2 weddings on one day. How blessed are we? Since Brielle's was booked at the Marquis so last minute, and Jason's family is flying in from Europe, we've had to make a tough decision. I noted the priority, of course, must be Brielle's event on the East Coast. We're asking all immediate family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, to please join us at the Marquis Hall to support her. It's just easier for everyone to be in one place. The directive was clear. Nora, being the strong and logical person she is, completely understands and sends her love. For those of you who aren't immediate family, or who are free and in the Red Haven area, perhaps you can swing by Willow Court later in the day and say hello to Nora and David. We'll join you all for her celebration when we return after the new year. Let's make this a Christmas to remember. I was officially demoted. I was no longer a bride. I was an optional stopover. A regional meeting nobody important had to attend. I saw the names in the group chat. My grandmother, Helen, my father's siblings, my cousins, all of them, now directed by Marla's efficient logistics. I looked at the message. I saw the scene by notifications pop up one by one. Silence. They were all waiting. I did not reply. I exited the group. I opened my laptop. I pulled up my original guest list of 120 names. I took a pen and began my audit. I crossed off Marla. I crossed off Brielle. I crossed off the relatives I hadn't spoken to in 5 years, the ones who only showed up for Marla's productions. I was left with 54 names. These were the people who sat at the folding card table with me, the quiet ones, the observers, my father's mother, Helen, my friends, my chosen family. I opened my personal email. I composed 54 separate individual messages. I did not BCC. Each one was personal. The subject line was simple: a change of plans and an invitation. The message itself was short. It did not mention Brielle or Marla or the Marcus Hall. It did not mention conflict or priority or being strong. It contained no anger. It was not a plea. It was a clear, simple correction to the manifest. You may have heard of a scheduling conflict on December 22nd. I want to make this simple for you. I am not competing for your attendance. My wedding to David will not be at Willow Court. It will be held at Lindenfall Garden, on the hill above town, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It will be small, quiet, and outdoors. There is no pressure to choose, but I wanted you to know where we will be. If you want to be present, this is where we will have a seat saved for you. This is where you will have a place. I hit send on all 54 emails. I closed the laptop. The tension that had been coiled in my spine for 2 months, the heat of that interrupted phone call, finally dissipated. The system was rerouted. The data was clean. The choice was no longer mine to make. The path to Lindenfall Garden was unpaved. It was a simple wide track of gray gravel that crunched under our shoes, a sound like dry bones or crushing seashells, and it forced you to slow down. You could not rush. The path wound up a low hill, through bare-limbed aspen trees whose white bark looked like chalk strokes against the dark, frozen earth, and then, at the crest, the path opened up. It was not a clearing, it was a cathedral. The tree, the one the preserve called the Lindenfall pine, was immense. I had seen it in pictures, but the physical presence of it silenced me. It was a 400-year-old giant, easily 12 feet in diameter at its base. Its lowest branches, thicker than my own body, started low and spread wide, creating a canopy that felt both sheltering and ancient. This was our venue. There was no glasshouse, no polished parquet dance floor, no crystal chandeliers. There was just the tree, the dormant winter-brown grass, and the sharp, clean, cold air of the high desert. Under its lowest boughs, 2 long, dark wooden tables were set, aligned perfectly, waiting, glass lanterns, simple boxes of metal and glass holding thick white candles, sat in a perfect straight line down the center. I had rejected spectacle. The spectacle was happening 2,000 miles away, on the East Coast. Marla and Brielle could have it. They could have the ice sculptures and the 5-course menus, and the heavy, hothouse floral arrangements that suffocated the air. I wanted something that felt real in my hands, something that had weight. The tables were bare wood, the grain deep and rough, stained, almost black. We did not use fine china. We used heavy, cream-colored earthenware that felt warm to the touch, even in the cold. The centerpieces were not towers of roses. I had bought several long, winding garlands of faux olive branches, a symbol of peace, perhaps, but for me, a symbol of resilience, of a thing that can grow in difficult, rocky soil and still bear fruit. We draped them down the center of the tables, woven between the glass lanterns. The napkins were not silk. They were unbleached, raw linen, the color of oatmeal, rough and honest, tied with a simple piece of jute twine. There was nothing for show. Everything on that table was for use. Every item had a purpose, a weight, a texture. It was the antithesis of an empty box. Our caterer was a local woman, Signora Livia, who ran a small Italian bakery and deli in the old part of town. She was in her 70s, with a face like a beautiful, crumpled map, and hands covered in flour and old burns. She had not presented me with a binder of tiered options and pricing structures. She had sat me down at her own kitchen table, poured me a tiny glass of Amaro, and told me what she was cooking. "It is December," she said, tapping a wooden spoon on the counter for emphasis. "The ground is hard. We do not pretend it is summer. We do not fly in berries from Peru. We eat what is strong. We eat what has been saved." The menu was simple, elemental. Roasted root vegetables, carrots, parsnips, potatoes, glazed with honey and thyme, a slow braised lamb stew, so dark it was almost black, rich with wine and rosemary, and the true centerpiece of the meal, her bread. She had her son-in-law build a small, mobile, wood-fired oven near the tree, a clay dome on a trailer. The air, already sharp with pine, now carried the heavy, intoxicating, almost holy scent of yeast and hardwood smoke. The main dish, the thing she was most proud of, was just that: thick, charred slices of her sourdough bread, grilled over the open fire, rubbed with a clove of raw garlic, and drizzled with olive oil and a heavy pinch of herbs from her own frozen garden. It was food that required you to be present. You could not ignore it. The gifts were already at the tables. For each of the 54 guests, there was a small, dark green bottle of olive oil, imported by Livia herself from her cousin's village in Sicily. The label was simple, printed on the same creamy cardstock as my handwritten notes. It did not say Nora and David. It did not list the date. It just said, "For being present." Underneath each earthenware plate, I had placed the notes. I had written them the night before, my hand aching, my gaze steady. 54 individual, handwritten letters, to Ray, to my grandmother Helen, to my cousins who had chosen this, to David's parents, who had embraced me without question. Each note was different. I did not mention the conflict. I did not complain about Marla or Brielle. I did not frame this as a victory or a choice. I just wrote, over and over, in 54 different ways. I see you. Thank you for seeing me. My father arrived early, before any other guests. I saw his old pickup truck park at the bottom of the gravel path. He walked up slowly, alone, carrying a familiar brown paper bag. He looked small and out of place under the massive tree, his shoulders hunched. He looked lost without Marla to direct him, to tell him where to stand. "Nora," he said. His eyes scanned the scene. He looked at the rough tables, the simple napkins, the lanterns. I could see the confusion in his eyes. He was looking for the wedding. He was looking for the white ribbons, the towers of flowers, the satin, the signs of a proper event. "It's very nice," he said, his voice hesitant. "Very rustic." "It's quiet, Dad." He reached into his bag and pulled out one of his hand-poured candles, a thick, ivory-colored pillar, smelling of his signature pine and lavender blend. "I brought this," he said, his voice almost an apology. "Just to, clear the air." "The air is clear up here, Dad." He did not seem to hear me. He set the candle on the edge of the main table, fumbled in his coat pocket for a book of matches. He struck one. The small flame sputtered in the high-altitude breeze. He cupped his hand around it, his shoulders hunching further, his eyes fixed on the wick as it caught. He stared at that small, wavering flame for a long time. He was testing the wind. He was seeing if a single, small light could survive out here, unprotected. The flame caught, held, and then burned steady, a small, brave point of yellow in the growing dusk. He nodded, as if satisfied. He finally looked at me. "I'm glad it's not too windy for you," he said. Ray arrived next, not in a flowing dress, but in sharp black trousers and a tailored blazer, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder. She was my maid of honor and my logistics manager. She found the three-piece band, a cellist, a violinist, and an acoustic guitarist, and was directing them to a small, level patch of ground near the tree trunk. "No," I heard her say, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the cold. "No amplifiers, no microphones, just play. If they can't hear you, they'll lean in. That's the entire point." She strode over to me, her boots crunching on the gravel. She gave the scene a quick, professional appraisal. "It's perfect, Nora," she said. "It's exactly you. It's stable, it's functional, and it smells good." She checked her watch. 3:15. "Guests will start arriving in 30 minutes. Livia's fire is lit. Graham is. Lighting things. All systems are go." The sun began its descent, moving toward the western range, and the light changed. It became thick, heavy, and intensely golden. It was no longer the sharp white light of midday. It was the color of honey. It streamed through the gaps in the high branches, and where it hit the tables, it turned the olive oil in the small green bottles to liquid gold. The air smelled of three distinct, perfect things: the sharp, metallic tang of the cold, the deep, resinous perfume of the pine, and the warm, yeasty, savory promise of Livia's bread baking in the wood-fired oven. I stood by the trunk of the great tree, pressing my palm against its rough, ancient bark. It felt like a sleeping giant. I felt a profound, alien sense of peace. It was a silence that was not empty. It was not the strained silence of my father avoiding conflict, or my own childhood silence of swallowing the truth. It was a quiet fullness. I looked at the table, set for 54. I looked at the small bottles of oil. I looked at the handwritten notes. And I thought of that empty silver-wrapped box from 22 years ago. I felt the same stillness I felt then, sitting on the hearth. But this time, it was not the stillness of absence. It was the stillness of enough. The box was empty because it was meant to be filled with something else. It was being filled now. not with a trinket, but with the scent of baking bread, and the loyalty of the people who were, at that very moment, walking up the gravel path, and the simple, physical, undeniable fact of this present moment. Signora Livia found me by the tree, wiping her hands on her white apron. The bread is proofing, the fire is hot, everything is ready. She pointed to a small, separate table, set with a single white plate. Your cake, you are sure? The cake was small, round, and white. It was, as I had requested, one single tier. It was barely 8 inches across, frosted with a simple, rustic buttercream. Mrs. Fielding, Livia had asked me, baffled, at our consultation. A wedding cake? It is piccolo, small. I'm sure, Signora. But a wedding needs a statement, 3 tiers, 4, with the pillars, and the sugar flowers. 1 tier is enough, Livia. I had told her, and I repeated it now, looking at the simple, unadorned white cake sitting there in the golden light. 1 tier is all we need, I smiled. The rest, I said, is just time. She looked at me, a long, appraising look, her dark eyes seeing everything, then she smiled, a deep, beautiful crackle of wrinkles. Va bene, she said, nodding. You are right. Enough is a feast. She walked back to her fire. The musicians began to play, a low melodic piece that mingled with the sound of the wind moving through the high, ancient pines. Ray gave me a nod. David came and stood beside me, taking my hand. His hand was warm. Everything was prepared. Every detail was accounted for. There were no last-minute corrections. There were no frantic phone calls, no seating chart emergencies. The system was balanced. The manifest was correct. And for the first time in my life, I was not bracing for the chaos to begin. I was just present, at the Marcus Hall, 2,000 miles away. The ceremony began at precisely 4 o'clock Eastern Time. The ballroom was a cavern of crystal and light. $10,000 worth of Austrian chandeliers dripped from the ceiling, reflecting off the polished marble floor. But the light only illuminated the gaps. In the front row, on the groom's side, full. On Brielle's side, the first 3 rows, reserved for the immediate family Marla had summoned, were conspicuously, painfully empty. A swath of white satin ribbon lay draped over chairs that held no one. At Lindenfall Garden, at 4 o'clock Mountain Time, the sun began its final, sharp descent. It was no longer high, it was low and direct. The light, piercing through the dense needles of the ancient pine, did not flood the space. It arrived in specific, focused beams, like theatrical spotlights. Long, solid shafts of pure gold light landed on the dark wood tables, illuminating a single glass, a hand, a strand of hair, turning the mundane into something sacred. Marla, standing beside Brielle at the marquee altar, her smile fixed and bright for the cameras, kept her phone clutched in her left hand, hidden by her bouquet of white orchids. A vibration, another. She glanced down, her smile tightening. Just flight delays, she whispered to her new son-in-law's mother, loud enough for the empty chairs to hear. You know, Christmas travel. They're all stuck at O'Hare. The weather, terrible. In Red Haven, the seats were full. All 54 chairs were taken. David and I looked out at the faces. They were not the loud central figures from those old Christmas photos. They were the quiet ones. My father's cousins from the valley. My old professor from college. The neighbors who had known me since I was 9. The people who had always inhabited the soft, blurry edges of the frame. Today, they were the center. They were the entirety. Brielle, her veil a cloud of imported lace, shifted her weight. She scanned the empty chairs meant for her family. Mom, she whispered, her voice tight, just before the music swelled. Where is Grandma? You said she was coming. You said she'd be here. Marla's smile did not flicker. Last minute, honey, she hissed back, patting Brielle's arm. Her hip, you know, the doctor said she just couldn't risk the flight. She's heartbroken. absolutely heartbroken. She sends all her love. At Lindenfall, a slow procession of one had just completed its journey up the gravel path. My grandmother, Helen Fielding, 91 years old, her back bent, but her gaze sharp. She had refused all help. She wore a thick, hand-knitted wool shawl, the color of dried lavender. She leaned heavily on her own cherrywood cane. She walked the entire slope herself. When she reached us, she did not hug me. She simply reached out her thin, papery hand, covered in liver spots and wedding rings, and placed it directly on top of mine. The first photograph taken at my wedding in Redhaven was not of the kiss. It was not of the rings. It was that. My grandmother's hand, veined and strong, resting on my own, a transfer of something unspoken. At the Marquis Hall, the photographer, a stressed man in a tight suit, was trying to frame the family portrait after the vows. He squinted through his lens. "Okay, great, beautiful," he said, forcing enthusiasm. "Mom, Brielle, can we pull those empty chairs out? Or maybe, let's just push the occupied chairs closer together, squeeze in. Everyone, tight, tight, tight. Let's make this look full and happy." At Lindenfall, our photographer, a young woman with a quiet lens, took her shots from a distance. She did not pose us. She did not rearrange a single chair. There was no need. In the cold, sharp air, everyone was already leaning in toward each other, drawn to the shared warmth of the tables, the candlelight, and the conversation. Brielle stood at the marble altar, the spotlight finding the glitter on her eyelids. She was reading her vows from a small, laminated card. Her voice was clear, but her eyes were not on her groom. They kept flicking, almost involuntarily, toward the massive, gilded double doors at the back of the ballroom, as if she were still expecting a grand entrance, as if the rest of the cast, the relatives she was promised, were just running late. I held David's hands. They were cold, but they were steady. I had no paper, no card. My vows were not for an audience. They were for the 54 people who had chosen to be there. "I did not know if this day would be full," I said, my voice carrying in the clear, pine-scented air. "I only knew it would be true. You are here. You chose to be present. That is the only gift. That is the only thing that matters." 2 weddings, happening at the exact same moment. One, a spectacular production in a palace of light, desperately trying to hide its own emptiness. The other, a simple meal under a dark tree, overflowing with nothing but the sun. The sun was gone. The world was now defined by small circles of light. The long, dark tables were illuminated by the dozens of glass lanterns, their candlelight flickering, and by the low orange glow from Signora Livia's cooling wood oven. The meal was over, the plates cleared, and the air was filled with the low murmur of conversation, the sound of people who were warm, fed, and present. The air smelled of coffee and pine smoke. David and I stood, and we began to hand out the small, dark green bottles of olive oil. We walked down the length of the tables, placing one by each guest. It was not a grand presentation, just a quiet delivery, hand to hand. "Thank you for coming," I said, over and over. "Thank you for being here." My cousin Mark held the bottle up to the lantern light, admiring the deep color. "It's beautiful. Nora, what's this on the bottom?" A few others had noticed, a faint, milky, almost invisible smudge on the glass, like a watermark. My father, who had been sitting quietly at the head of the table next to my grandmother, picked his up. He turned it over, squinting in the dim light. His thumb rubbed at the mark, but it did not come off. He looked up at me, his gaze searching, the way he looked at one of my complex schematics, trying to find the logic. "Nora?" he asked. His voice was quiet. "What did you hide in here? Another one of your systems?" I smiled, just slightly. I looked at the candle he had placed on the table, the one he had hand-poured, which had been burning steadily all night, its small flame a fixed point in the center of our gathering. "Not a system, Dad, just a thank you. It's written in a special ink. It only shows up when it's warm enough." A ripple of curiosity moved down the table. People held their bottles, looking for a source of heat. My father, his brow furrowed in concentration, did not hesitate. He picked up his bottle of oil. He held it close to the open flame of his own candle. He did not hold it over the flame, but beside it, letting the ambient, invisible heat wash over the glass. He held it there for 10 seconds, 20. I watched him. I did not breathe. He was a man who had spent a lifetime avoiding friction, avoiding the fire, and now he was willingly, methodically, holding his gift to the flame. The milky smudge began to change. It darkened, coalescing. The invisible ink reacted to the warmth, turning a deep, permanent brown. Slowly, as if emerging from the glass itself, words appeared. My father angled the bottle to catch the light. "Thank you for truly coming." He read the words, his lips moving silently. He stared at them, and then he stared at the candle, his flame, his creation. He looked at the bottle, and then at the flame, and I could see his mind, the mind of a meticulous craftsman, of a builder, begin to connect two things that had been separate for 22 years. His gaze became distant. He was no longer under the tree at Lindenfall. He was in his garage. Decades ago, the air thick with the smell of melted beeswax and lavender. "The candles," he whispered, so low I barely heard it. He was speaking to himself. I used to use them for the seals." His eyes snapped back into focus. He looked at me, a new, sharp, and terrified light in them. That Christmas, the year you were 10. I did not speak. I just held his gaze. "I remember," he said, his voice cracking. "I remember I was making a whole batch of green wax for the gifts." He looked down at his hands, as if seeing them press a seal into hot wax. The tags, the box, the story, the lie. He looked up, his eyes pleading. "Nora, the tag, the old gift tag, do you still have it?" I nodded once. I had not planned this. I had not brought it as a weapon. But I had brought it because a logistician never travels without her manifest. I reached into the pocket of my jacket. I pulled out the small, acid-free envelope I had filed it in 2 months ago. I slid it out. It was just a small piece of old, yellowed cardstock. The corners were bent, the string was gone, but the front was clear. In Marla's looping cursive, "To Nora, from Santa." And in the bottom right corner, there was a small, perfect, dark green circle of wax, hardened with age. And pressed into the center of that wax was the unmistakable, intricate impression of my grandfather's signet ring, the one I had used for my own wedding invitations, the one my father used for all his special projects. Graham took it from my hand. His fingers, calloused from his woodwork, trembled, brushing against the raised edge of the wax seal. He held the tag in one palm and the bottle of oil in the other. "I sealed them," he whispered, his voice thick. "I sealed all the family gifts that year. I sat at the kitchen table for hours. I wanted it to be special. I sealed every single one." He looked at the tag. He looked at me. All of them, except two gifts, the big doll for Brielle, and one other, Marla said. She said she had them. She said she would handle those two herself, that they were delicate. She said, "Don't worry about it, Graham. It's just easier if I do it." He looked at the tag in his hand, the tag with my name, and his seal, the tag that had been found, torn and discarded, in a box of broken ornaments, the tag that proved there had been a real, sealed, significant gift for me, and the box I had received, the empty silver one, had been a prop. It had a cheap, peel-off bow and a tag with no seal. He understood. He finally, truly understood. The test, the joke, the difficult child, the story that had defined me, the one he had permitted with his silence, had been a fabrication from the very beginning, The game had not been mine, it was Marla's. The candle between us continued to burn. The flame was steady, unwavering. On the dark wood of the table, the yellow light pooled, illuminating the old sealed tag and the new, heat-revealed bottle. They were two pieces of evidence, 22 years apart, linked by the same flame. I did not smile. I did not cry. I did not say, "I told you so." There was no triumph in me. I had lived with this truth for so long it had become a part of my bones. Seeing it on his face was not a victory, it was just an ache. I sat down. I waited. I had presented the data. I had shown the flaw in the system. I did not need to scream, or to point, or to demand an apology. I just needed him, the man who had always run from the fire, to sit in the warmth of the truth and, for the first time, not look away. The guests left slowly, in small, quiet groups. The crunch of their shoes on the gravel path faded, leaving the five of us under the tree in the sudden, deep silence of the high-altitude night. The lanterns were burning low. Signora Livia's crew had packed up the oven and the earthenware, leaving only the two long wooden tables, the guttering candles, and the cold. Ray, my maid of honor, my lawyer, was stacking the empty olive oil bottles into a crate, her movements precise. She held one up, watching the flame from my father's candle flicker against the glass. "This is good," she said, her voice clear in the cold air. She looked at the tag my father was still holding, the one with his wax seal. "This is motive, this is intent, but it's not the act itself. A good defense attorney, and Marla is a great defense attorney for her own life, will say she misplaced the tag, that it was a mistake. She'll call it a coincidence." My father flinched, but he knew she was right. "What we need," Ray continued, "is the data from the event itself. We need the inventory log from that night." "It was 22 years ago. Ray," I said, pulling my jacket tighter. "There is no log." My father looked up. His face, in the candlelight, was a mask of shadows and new, terrible understanding. "Yes, there is," he said. His voice was rough. I filmed it. I filmed everything back then." He looked at me. "You remember? That big Sony camera I bought? The one with the shoulder mount? I filmed every Christmas. The wrapping, the morning, the dinner, all of it." My grandmother, Helen, who was wrapped in 3 blankets, nodded slowly. "You were obsessive. Graham, a box of tapes. You said it was our legacy." Ray snapped the crate closed. "Where is this legacy, Graham?" An hour later, we were not at my father's house. We were at my condo. The transition was jarring. We left the ancient, cold, pine-scented night of Lindenfall and entered my sterile, clean, concrete and glass box. I turned on the lights. My precise, self-wired pendants and the warm, clean light flooded the room. David, my husband, began making coffee, the smell of it sharp and necessary. My father had gone to his house. Marla was not due back from the East Coast for 2 more days, and returned with a single, large, plastic storage tub. It was labeled Family Media 1995 to 2005. Inside was a mess of old technology, a dozen small, white plastic tapes labeled Mini DV, a handful of early-generation memory cards, and a tangle of proprietary cables. "The camera's broken," he said, pulling out a tape. The playback mechanism, it's jammed." "We don't need the camera," Ray said. She was already unzipping her laptop bag. She pulled out a small, black device. "I keep an all-formats reader for Discovery. Plug it in." We sat, the 5 of us, crowded around my coffee table. David set down mugs. Helen held hers with both hands, the steam rising into her face. My father slid the tape into the reader. Ray double-clicked. The screen flickered, and my living room was filled with the ghost of Christmas past. It was exactly as I remembered. The picture quality was grainy. The colors bled. The camera was unsteady, jerky, moving with my father's walk. We saw the tree, glittering with tinsel. We saw a 10-year-old me, already quiet, sitting on the hearth, methodically counting the lights on a string, we saw a 5-year-old Brielle, a blur of red velvet, screaming as she rode a new bicycle through the living room. "This is the morning," I said. "This is after." "He's right," Ray said. Her eyes narrowed at the screen. "We need the night before, Christmas Eve, when the presents were being wrapped." My father's hands were shaking as he sifted through the tapes. He found one labeled with a black marker, Xmas Eve 10 Yrs. He slid it in. This footage was different. The camera was not moving. He must have set it down on the mantel, facing the fireplace and the tree, and forgotten to turn it off. For 10 minutes, the video was just an empty room, the sound muffled. And then, Marla walked into the frame. She was in her silk robe, the one I remembered. She had a glass of wine in one hand. She sat on the floor, in the sea of gifts, and began to work. We watched her, in silence. She was efficient, humming along to a barely audible Bing Crosby song. She held up bows. She taped paper. She signed tags. And then it happened. It was not dramatic. It was not violent. It was simple, casual, and utterly brutal. The camera, from its high angle, saw everything. She had 2 boxes in front of her. One was the small, silver box. The other was a large, brightly colored box that clearly held the doll Brielle had wanted. We watched her hand. She had 2 tags, one to Brielle, the other to Nora. We watched, in grainy, 22-year-old video, as she picked up the Nora tag, the one my father had sealed, looked at it, and then deliberately, calmly, stuck it onto the large doll box. Then she took the Brielle tag, peeled the back, and stuck it on the small, silver box. A moment later, she seemed to reconsider. She peeled the Nora tag off the doll box, tearing the paper slightly, and tossed it aside into the pile of scraps by the fireplace. That was the tag I had found. Decades later, in the ornament box. She then took a blank, cheap, peel and stick tag, wrote Nora on it, and slapped it onto the small, empty silver box. She had, in 30 seconds, rerouted the entire manifest. She sat back, took a sip of her wine, and admired her work, a quick, efficient swap. It's just easier this way. The room was silent. The only sound was the low hum of the laptop fan. My father made a noise, a small, choked sound, as if he had been punched in the stomach. He did not look at me. He did not look at his mother. He stared at the screen, at the image of his smiling wife, and he went utterly, profoundly still. It was the stillness of a man watching a building he had lived in his whole life collapse in on itself, revealing a foundation that was rotten to the core. All his small acts of peace, the candles, the clearing of plates, the whistling, the avoidance, were not peace. They were complicity. They were the building materials for the lie. His silence had not just been a component, it had been the primary, load-bearing wall. I turned from the screen. I did not need to see it again. I watched my father. His face was gray. I stood up, walked to my desk, and unlocked the drawer. I pulled out the file labeled Fielding Domestic Logistics. I brought it back to the coffee table and opened it. I did not do it for cruelty. I did it for accuracy. She did not stop at the box, Dad. I laid out the bank statements from the joint family event fund he and Marla had established, the one I had been required to contribute 10% of my salary to since I had gotten my job at North Star. For future weddings, for emergencies, Marla had said. I showed him my contributions, highlighted in yellow, a steady, predictable deposit, month after month, for 10 years. Then I showed him the withdrawal slips. They were all signed by Marla. Brielle, app deposit. Brielle, yoga certification. Brielle, car down payment. And the last one, dated just 6 months ago, for $50,000. The memo line read, Marcus Hall, deposit. My money had paid for the wedding that was designed to erase mine. The empty box was not an event. It was a system. My father put his head in his hands. Ray reached over and gently paused the video, freezing the frame on Marla's hand, suspended between the two boxes. The image was grainy, blurry, but the act was perfectly, undeniably clear. "We don't put this on Facebook." "Nora," Ray said softly, her litigator's mind switching from discovery to strategy, "we don't need a crowd. We don't need a jury of public opinion. We just need accuracy." I nodded, the word accuracy feeling cool and clean in my mouth. "I don't want revenge, Ray," I said. "I'm not trying to burn the house down. I want the family's memory to start working again. I want us to operate from a true ledger." "Okay," Ray said. "Then we don't need the motion picture. We just need the data point." She hit the print screen key. The printer in my office whirred to life. A single sheet of paper slid out. It was black and white, grainy, a low-resolution snapshot of a crime. Just a pair of hands, 2 boxes, 2 tags, an act of casual erasure, frozen in time. My father lifted his head. He looked at the paper. He reached for it. His hand, for the first time I could remember, steady. He picked it up. He did not crumple it. He did not tear it. He folded it. Once, twice. He folded it with the slow, deliberate care of a man handling a sacred text or a death certificate. He slipped the folded paper into his breast pocket, over his heart. He patted the pocket, as if to confirm the weight of it. It was a letter he had refused to read for 22 years, and it had finally been delivered. My grandmother, Helen, who had watched the entire video without a single change in her expression, finally spoke. She set her empty coffee mug on the table with a firm click. She looked at her son. Her voice was not angry. It was not sad. It was final. "Tomorrow," she said, "is Christmas Eve, the day the story started." She looked at the candle my father had left on my counter, the unlit one from his bag. "Tomorrow, Graham," she said, "you will let your father light the candle." The plan was set. It would not be an ambush. It would not be a public shaming at the dinner table. We would not have an audience. The goal was simpler and far more complex. It was to create a space so quiet, so focused, that Marla would be the only person in the room who could not hear the sound of her own voice and the lie it had been telling for 2 decades. At the Marcus Hall, the sound was a weapon. The reception was underway, and the 5-piece orchestra, hired to project expense and joy, was playing a brassy, frantic version of swing music. The sound was too big for the room, or perhaps the room was too empty for the sound. It bounced off the high, coffered ceilings and the polished marble, creating a harsh, glittering echo, and underneath the music, there was the sound of the guests, the 30 or 40 who had come, laughing. They were laughing too loud. Their laughter was sharp, a percussive, brittle sound, a conscious effort to fill the vast, empty spaces, to cover the sight of the dozens of round tables set for 10 that held only 2, or 1, or none. They were trying to plaster over the silence with sheer, desperate volume. At Lindenfall, the silence was a presence. It was the deep, cold, absolute quiet of the high desert night, a silence so profound you could hear the blood in your own ears. The only music came from a single acoustic guitar, played by one of David's friends. He sat on a low stool near the tree trunk, his fingers picking out a slow, intricate melody. The notes did not fill the space. They traveled through it, each one clear and distinct, like a stone dropped in a dark well. When a glass clinked, it was not a crash. It was a single, warm ching, a toast. We could hear the children, 4 or 5 of them, bundled in coats, laughing as they chased each other in the dark, their high-pitched shrieks cutting the cold air with pure, uncomplicated joy. Marla felt the vibration in her hand, then another. She kept her smile locked in place, that wide, brilliant smile she reserved for public performance. But her eyes were cold. She glanced down at her phone, hidden in the folds of her beaded gown. Text messages, photos, one from her own cousin, Judith. It was not a text of congratulations. It was a picture, a grainy, Low-light photo from Redhaven, a long table under a tree, candlelight, and in the center, unmistakable even in the dark, was Helen Fielding, her grandmother-in-law, raising a glass. Another text came in, from a different relative, a video snippet, the 54 guests at Lindenfall, their faces illuminated by flame, listening to a toast. Marla snapped the phone shut. She turned to Jason's mother, her laugh a tinkling, fragile sound. "Can you believe them?" she said, her voice dripping with pity. "They must have taken those pictures hours ago. A quick little ceremony before packing up, I guess. So sad. They must be freezing." At Lindenfall, Helen Fielding, 91 years old, her thin white hair like spun glass in the lantern light, gripped my father's arm. He helped her to her feet. She held her glass of water, her hand shaking with age. But her voice was like steel. It cut through the quiet. "I am not one for speeches," she said, her old-world accent clear. "But I look at this table, and I see a miracle." She looked at me, then at David, then at every guest, one by one. "There are two kinds of gatherings, those where people are arranged, and those where people arrive. Thank you," she said, her voice cracking just once. "For these seats, the ones filled by will, not by arrangement." My father stood beside me. He heard his mother's words. He felt the weight of the folded screenshot in his breast pocket. He watched his mother sit, and then he reached for the second candle he had brought in his brown paper bag. He placed it on the table, next to the first. He struck a match. The sound of the sulfur scraping the box was loud in the stillness. I watched his hand as he brought the flame to the wick. It was trembling. Not a light shake, but a clear, visible tremor, the kind you get from holding a heavy weight for too long. He lit the second candle, and the pool of light on our table doubled in size. At the marquee, the photographer was losing his patience. He was trying to get a wide shot of the reception, and all he was getting was a portrait of failure. Empty chairs, empty tables, empty dance floor. Folks, this is not working," he said, his voice tight with frustration. He waved his assistant over. Let's consolidate. Let's move these 3 tables. Push them right up against the main table. Just push them together. Make it look intimate." The sound of chair legs scraping across the marble floor was like a scream. Brielle watched them do it. She watched the staff physically dismantle the party she had been promised, pushing furniture around to create the illusion of a celebration. The orchestra had taken a break, and in the sudden, appalling silence, she heard the photographer's muttered command. She looked at the empty chairs, the ones meant for Helen, for her uncles, for the cousins she had known her whole life. She turned and looked at her mother. Marla was texting furiously, her face pale, her bright smile gone, replaced by a thin white line. "Mom?" Brielle said. Her voice was small, a child's voice. "Mom, where are they?" Marla did not look up. "It's fine, Brielle. They had travel issues. It is fine." "You said they were coming," Brielle whispered. Her lips began to tremble, and she pressed them together, hard, stopping the tears with pure, cold anger. A vast, echoing silence descended on the main table, a void that no amount of music could fill. Into the quiet at Lindenfall, there was a new sound, the crunch of gravel, and a low, happy humming. Signora Livia emerged from the shadows, carrying a single, round white plate. On it sat our cake, the one-tier cake. It was simple, white, and perfect. She placed it in front of us, the single candle on its surface already lit. There was no fanfare. Ray just smiled and began to sing softly, in her low alto. "Happy, happy wedding day." A few others joined, their voices hesitant, then stronger. A quiet, slightly awkward, perfectly earnest chorus rising into the pine-scented air. I looked at David. I looked at the single flame. I closed my eyes. I thought of the empty box, and I thought of the 54 faces, and I thought of the screenshot of a hand switching a tag. I made my wish. A wish that had no words and no names. A wish for the simple, clean, cold logic of cause and effect. I opened my eyes and blew out the candle. My father was watching me. The tremor in his hand was gone. He was not looking at me with his usual, pained, peace-seeking expression. He was looking at me with a new, quiet, and terrible clarity. His face was set. He was a man who had finally read the full manifest and understood, at last, what he had to do. The next day was Christmas. Marla and Brielle flew back to Red Haven, exhausted and furious, ready to blame the weather, the airlines, and me, everyone in the family, scattered by the 2 weddings, thought the story was over. They thought the holiday would be tense, but finished. They thought the lines were drawn, the choices made. They were wrong. Christmas morning, the familiar scent of Douglas fir and my father's coffee filled the living room, but the air was brittle, stretched thin. It was a forced gathering, a command performance. David and I sat on the cold hearth, a strategic distance from the center. Ray, my lawyer, my maid of honor, my witness, stood near the window, her arms crossed, observing. My grandmother, Helen, was in her high-backed armchair. Rigid, Brielle was curled on the sofa, her face puffy and pale, nursing a mug of tea. She had not spoken a word to me, and my father, Graham, stood by the fireplace, his hands behind his back, a statue of a man. Marla was the only one in motion. She was a hummingbird of forced cheer, flitting around the base of the tree, rearranging bows, shaking gifts, her voice a high, sharp trill. Well, what a Christmas. Everyone together. Just wonderful. Brielle, darling, look at this one. It feels heavy. Nora, I do hope you and David are comfortable. No one moved. No one reached for a gift. The silence was an accusation. Marla's movements slowed. Her smile tightened. She picked up a stray red ribbon and pulled it taut between her fingers until her knuckles went white. She turned to me. The performance began. You know, Nora, she said, her voice dropping into that practiced, wounded tone, the one she used to establish herself as the victim. I am just deeply disappointed. I waited. I said nothing. To split this family in 2, on Christmas, after all the work I did to try and accommodate everyone, we tried so hard to make it to your little thing. But the travel, it was impossible. The flights were not canceled. Marla, Ray said, her voice flat, from the window. Marla's head snapped toward her. I beg your pardon? The flights from the East Coast were all on time. I checked. There was no weather at O'Hare. You just chose not to leave until this morning. This is a family matter, Marla hissed. No, I said. My voice was quiet, but it stopped her. It is a logistical matter. You have always been this way, Marla said, her voice rising, finding its familiar rhythm of complaint. Always difficult, always making things hard. It would have been so much easier for everyone, for your father, if you had just... Easier, I repeated. I stood up. David put his hand on my arm, but I didn't need it. I walked to the bag I had placed by the door. I reached inside. I did not pull out the video. I did not pull out the bank statements. I pulled out the original artifact. I walked to the heavy oak coffee table, covered in Marla's festive porcelain angels, and I placed it in the center. It was the box. The small, silver, cardboard box from 22 years ago. It was faded. The corners were soft with age and damp from the attic. A dark, tacky square of ancient adhesive showed where a tag had once been. It landed on the wood with a hollow, empty sound. The entire room went still. Brielle sat up, her eyes wide. Marla stopped breathing. What? Marla whispered, her voice no longer musical. Is that? You know what it is, I said. It's the box you gave me, the one you told everyone I lied about. That's ridiculous. You're inventing... Wait. My father's voice. It was not a request. It was a command. He walked past me, his face set, and went to the main light switch on the wall. He pressed the dimmer and slid it all the way down. The bright, sterile overhead lights faded to black. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the pulsing, chaotic, multicolored lights of the Christmas tree. They cast thick, moving shadows on the walls, just as they had when I was 10. Graham walked back to the coffee table, his steps heavy. From his pocket, he took one of his own hand-poured candles, a thick white pillar. From his other pocket, a book of matches. He struck one, the sound of the sulfur scraping. The shk was explosive in the quiet room. A single steady flame bloomed. He lit the candle's wick. He held the match until it burned his fingers, then dropped it into an ashtray. He placed the single, tall candle on the table, right next to the empty silver box. Then, from the breast pocket of his shirt, he took the folded piece of paper, the screenshot from the mini DV tape. He unfolded it slowly. He laid it flat on the table, on the other side of the candle. The effect was instant. It was no longer a dim, grainy image. The single, low, direct flame of the candle acted like a spotlight, raking across the cheap printer paper. It illuminated the details. It threw the shadows into sharp relief. The hands, Marla's hands, the Nora tag with his wax seal, the Brielle tag, the clear, undeniable act of the swap. The room was stone-cold silent. The only sound was the faint, electric hum of the tree lights. No one breathed. My father looked across the table, his face half in shadow, half in yellow light, and he looked directly at Marla. He spoke, his voice slow, heavy, the words dropping into the silence like anvils. Nora did not lie. He took a sharp, ragged breath. I did not look. The silence that followed was absolute. Brielle, her face as white as the candle wax, turned her head slowly, mechanically, toward her mother. Her voice was a tiny, broken whisper. Mom? Was that you? Mom? What is that? Marla tried to find her laugh. It was a dreadful, dry, rattling sound. Oh, my darling, don't be. This is absurd. It was a joke, a silly test. It was 22 years ago, for God's sake. Nora is just... A joke that lasts 2 decades is a story. My grandmother. Helen's voice cut through the dark. She had not moved from her chair, but her words had the force of a gavel. You wrote a story. Marla, you cast Nora as the villain. You cast yourself as the victim. You made my son the fool, and you made your own daughter the center of a lie. I did it to protect her, Marla shrieked, finally finding her volume. I did it to make things easier. No, my father said. He reached down to the laptop bag at his feet. He set it on the table. He opened it. The cold, blue light of the screen illuminated his face. He pressed the spacebar. He did not play the whole tape. He played only the 30 seconds he had cued. The clip from the mantle cam. The sound was tinny, awful, full of static, but in the dead quiet of that room, her voice was perfectly, horribly clear. This big one, this is for Brielle, and the other, the silver one, it can just be empty. It's fine. He pressed the space bar. The screen went black. The only light was the candle. This was the part where the movie in my head always ended in screams. This was the scene of violence, of accusations, of thrown objects and slammed doors. None of that happened. There was no violence. There was no shouting. There was no grand confrontation. There was just the evidence, sitting on the table, illuminated by a single flame. It was a room full of adults, forced to look at the truth. Marla stared at the dark screen. She looked at Graham, her husband, his face a mask of cold resolution. She looked at Helen, the family's judge, whose eyes were narrowed and unforgiving. She looked at Brielle, whose face was not angry, but simply broken. She was seeing, for the first time, the architecture of her own life, and realizing the foundation was fraudulent. Finally, Marla looked at me. I was not crying. I was not triumphant. I was just done. She opened her mouth. She tried to find a word, a defense, an excuse. Easier, perhaps, but the word would not come. She sat down, heavily, on the edge of the sofa. Her hands, those capable, arranging, manipulative hands, fell limp into her lap. She was empty. The story she had told for 22 years, the one that had become the defining legend of our blended family, was over, the punchline. She hit her with lies, was finally, irrevocably, true, just not about me. The room was still, caught in the single, steady flame of the candle. My father, Graham, finally broke the silence. He turned his body fully toward me. His face, illuminated by the light he had lit, was stripped bare of all the old, easy excuses. "Nora," he said, his voice thick, "I am sorry. I am sorry I let my silence stand on the wrong side of the truth. I am sorry I did not look." He then turned to the sofa. Brielle was watching him, her eyes wide and wet, her face a mask of dawning, horrified understanding. "Brielle," he said, his voice softer but just as firm, "you do not have to carry the burden for what your mother did. That is not yours. But from this day forward, you must not accept the parts that do not belong to you." Brielle looked at her mother, then at me, then at the grainy screenshot on the table. She looked down at her own wrist. She was wearing a heavy gold link bracelet, one I recognized from her childhood, a special gift Marla had given her when she was 12. She fumbled with the clasp. It opened with a small click. She slid the heavy gold off her arm. She leaned forward and placed it on the coffee table, next to the empty box. The metal made a solid, final sound against the wood. "I want to start over," she whispered, her voice raw. "I want to start over without needing to be the center." Marla let out a long, shuddering breath. She tried, one last time, to find her smile. It was a terrible, desperate grimace in the candlelight. Graham, I thought," she stammered, her hands twisting in her lap. "I thought I was holding this family together. I thought I was keeping things stable. I just wanted peace." "Stability," my grandmother Helen said, her voice cutting through Marla's excuse from the darkness of her armchair, "is not the same as erasing people from the frame just because they are quiet." My father looked at the single, burning candle. He reached into the brown paper bag he had brought from Lindenfall and took out the remaining candles, the ones he had made in his workshop. He placed 5 of them on the table. "I spent my life," he said, "lighting candles to clear the air, to hide the smell of what we wouldn't say. Tonight, we light them to see." He held the matchbook out. "We will light one, each of us, for a person we failed to see." He lit a long, thin taper from the main candle. He offered it to Brielle first. She looked at him, terrified. She took the taper, her hand shaking violently. She stared at the flame, then at me. She leaned forward and lit the first new candle. "For Nora," she whispered. "For the Nora I was told was difficult. I'm sorry." My father offered the taper to me. I took it. The wax was warm. I looked at the small, empty silver box. I lit the second candle. "For the 10-year-old girl," I said, my voice clear. "The one who was pushed to the margin. The one who learned to count lights instead of speaking. I see you." He offered the taper to David, who lit the third. "For the man I love," David said, his voice steady. "Who taught me that presence is a choice." My father looked at his mother. Helen reached forward, her old hand steady, and lit the fourth. "For my son," she said, her voice dry, "who chose silence because he thought it was kind, and forgot that silence is a weapon." My father lit the 5th candle himself. "For my wife," he said, and Marla looked up, shocked. "The woman I married, the one I stopped seeing, the one I let be replaced by the manager, the one I failed." Finally, he held the taper out to Marla. She stared at it as if it were a snake. She did not move. "Marla," he said, just her name. She flinched, slowly, with an infinite, agonizing reluctance. She reached out and took the taper. Her hand was rigid. She held it over the last unlit wick. She hesitated for a long, long time. We watched her. Her face caught between the light and the shadow. Her defenses gone. She lit the candle. She did not look at me. She did not look at Brielle. She stared into the new flame. "For the truth," she choked out. She offered no defense, no justification. She just said the word. The table was now bright. 6 flames threw a warm, moving light across the room. The glow hit the objects on the table. It reflected off the empty silver box. It lit the grainy screenshot. And it hit the dark green bottle of olive oil I had brought back from Lindenfall, the one my father had held to the flame. The heat from the new constellation of candles was enough. On the side of the glass, the words that had been invisible were now dark, clear, and stark. "Thank you for truly coming." It sat on the table like a verdict, a final manifesto. I reached for the empty silver box. I picked it up. It was just cardboard. It held no more power. I stood, walked to the Christmas tree, and placed it back underneath, tucking it behind a larger gift. It belonged there. It was part of the story, but it was not the whole story. I took a small linen ribbon from my pocket, one left over from the wedding, and tied it into a simple bow around the box. On the ribbon, I had written one thing: "Fullness is a choice." I turned back to them. "I am not posting the video," I said. "I am not sending the screenshot. I am not telling the extended family. This ledger, it stays in this room. I do not want a public apology." Marla looked at me, her eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic gratitude. "But," I continued, "there is a new rule, a new operational procedure for this family. From now on, at every gathering, every holiday, every dinner, there will be a seat for everyone, and the conversation, the photograph, the spotlight. It will include the quietest person in the room, or I will not be in the room." My father nodded. "A seat for everyone," he repeated. He walked over to the wall by the dining room. It was Marla's gallery wall, a tight, perfect grid of 2 decades of family photos. Brielle in the center, always. Brielle with the swim ribbon. Brielle with the graduation cap. Me, on the edge. He looked at the arrangement, the one he had lived with for 20 years. Then he reached up, and he took down the central, largest frame. Brielle's laughing high school portrait. He set it on the floor. He walked to the bag where I had put my wedding album. He took out the single, framed photo Helen had insisted we print. It was the one from Lindenfall, the one of the 54 guests at the long table, under the tree. I was in the center, yes, but everyone was visible. Everyone was leaning in. He hung it, in the center, in the empty space, the new system. The next day, after the silence had settled, my phone vibrated. A text from Brielle. "I'm so sorry. Nora, truly, if we ever plan a party on the same day again, I will be the one to change mine." I looked at the text. I thought of the competition, the prioritization, the fight for a single day. "No need to overlap anymore," I typed back. "We can just choose different days. There is enough time." A week later, another message. This one from Marla. Her first direct communication. It was short. "I would like to host New Year's Day dinner. If you and David will come." No stage. A follow-up text came 2 seconds later. "Just simple food. And I promise, there will be enough chairs." The story ends there. Really. It ends not with a bang, but with a clearing of the table. It ends in my father's living room, after the new candles had burned down, after the apologies had been spoken, after the truth was finally, sitting at the table with us, my father, Graham, the man who loved to clear the air, reached out and blew out the last candle. The room went dark for a second, and then he turned on the lights, and the room was still bright. Because for the first time, we were all, finally, looking, we were all, finally, present. Thank you for listening to my story. Please drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from. I would love to connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to Lila Revenge Stories, like this video, and give it an extra boost by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.